Elvis walked into the Lauderdale Courts office on a sweltering August afternoon in 1956, his white Cadillac gleaming in the Memphis heat outside like a beacon from another world. The housing project manager, Robert Hayes, looked up from his paperwork-cluttered desk to see the most famous man in America standing in his doorway. Elvis was wearing a simple button-down shirt and dark slacks, looking nothing like the flashy performer gyrating across television screens nationwide. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the cramped government office that smelled of cigarette smoke and desperation. What Elvis said next would change the lives of 50 families for the next 15 years, and none of them would ever know who their mysterious guardian angel was. 6 months earlier, Elvis had been just another poor kid from East Tupelo trying to make it in Memphis, sleeping on friends' couches and counting pennies for gas money. The Presley family had lived in Lauderdale Courts from 1949 to 1953, crammed into a tiny 2-bedroom apartment that cost them $35 a month when Vernon could find steady work. Elvis remembered the walls so thin you could hear every argument, every crying baby, every family's private struggles echoing through the concrete hallways. He'd watched his Mama Gladys cry when the eviction notices came, folded and refolded until the paper was soft as fabric. He'd seen neighbors disappear in the middle of the night, their belongings scattered on the sidewalk like broken dreams, children clutching stuffed animals as their families loaded everything they owned into broken-down trucks that coughed black smoke into the humid Tennessee air. Those images had burned themselves into Elvis's memory with the permanence of scars, and now that he had more money than he'd ever dreamed of, he couldn't stop thinking about the families still trapped in that same cycle of poverty and fear. Hayes, a weathered man whose gray hair and tired eyes told the story of managing Lauderdale Courts for over a decade, had seen it all. Families destroyed by unemployment that lasted months, children going hungry while their parents worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads, elderly residents choosing between medication and rent payments. The walls of his office were covered with notices, regulations, and photographs of families who had lived in the complex over the years. When Elvis Presley walked into his office that day, Hayes assumed it was some kind of publicity stunt, maybe a photo opportunity for a magazine spread about the famous singer giving back to his roots. But what happened next stunned everyone. "Mr. Hayes," Elvis said, his voice quiet but carrying that unmistakable intensity that had captivated millions of fans, "I want to help some families here, but there's a condition that's more important than anything else. They can never know it's me. Ever." Elvis's hands fidgeted with the car keys in his pocket, the same nervous gesture he had had since childhood whenever he was serious about something important. Hayes studied the young man's face, searching for some hint of insincerity, some angle he was missing, some way this was going to turn into a press conference or publicity campaign. Instead, he saw something he rarely encountered in his line of work: genuine compassion without any desire for recognition or credit. Elvis's eyes held the same desperate understanding that Hayes saw in the faces of parents who came to his office begging for more time to pay their rent. Elvis continued, his voice gaining strength as he outlined his vision. "Mr. Hayes, I know what it's like to get that knock on the door at 8 in the morning, to see your mama count, and recount the same $20, hoping it'll somehow magically turn into 50. I know what it's like to go to bed hungry because there wasn't enough money for both rent and groceries, to wear the same pair of shoes until the soles have holes, to watch your daddy's face when he comes home from another day of looking for work that ain't there. I can't fix everything in this world, but I can fix this for some folks who deserve better than the hand they've been dealt." The proposal Elvis laid out was unprecedented in Hayes's 20 years of housing management experience. Elvis wanted to anonymously cover the rent for families who were struggling, but the assistance had to appear to come from completely different sources. Hayes would create fictional benefactors, perhaps a local businessman who preferred to remain anonymous, or a church fund that had received an unexpected donation, or a new community assistance program funded by mysterious philanthropists. The families would receive official letters explaining that they'd been selected for temporary housing assistance based on their circumstances and need, but they would never know that Elvis Presley was personally writing the checks that kept roofs over their heads. But what happened next became legend. Elvis didn't just want to pay rent for a few months like some celebrity charity gesture. He was talking about a systematic, long-term commitment that would span years, maybe decades. He wanted Hayes to identify the families most at risk of eviction, the ones with sick children whose medical bills consumed every spare dollar. Elderly grandparents living on government checks that barely covered utilities, parents struggling with disabilities that prevented them from working full-time. He wanted to know about the families where both parents worked multiple jobs but still couldn't make ends meet because of medical emergencies or unexpected expenses, and the single mothers who were choosing between medicine for their children and keeping their electricity on during the brutal Memphis summers. Hayes was overwhelmed by the scope of what Elvis was proposing. In his 20 years of housing management, dealing with government bureaucracy, tight budgets, and desperate families, he'd never encountered anything like this. "Mr. Presley," he said, leaning back in his creaking chair, "do you understand what you're proposing here? We're talking about potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. These families, once you start helping them, they might need assistance for months, maybe years. Are you prepared for that kind of financial commitment? Are you sure you understand what you're getting yourself into?" Elvis looked out the window at the courtyard where children were playing in the late afternoon heat, their laughter echoing off the brick buildings like music. Some of those children were wearing clothes that had been mended multiple times, shoes that were clearly too small but had to last until the next paycheck, but their joy was infectious and pure. They reminded him of himself at that age, finding happiness and wonder despite the circumstances, making games out of bottle caps and finding adventure in empty lots filled with weeds. He watched a little girl with pigtails teaching a younger boy how to jump rope, both of them completely absorbed in their simple pleasure, oblivious to the adult worries that kept their parents awake at night. "Mr. Hayes, I've been thinking about this for months, ever since my record started selling and I realized I had more money than my family ever dreamed existed. My mama always said that when you're blessed, you pass those blessings on. Not for recognition, not for tax breaks, not for publicity, or to make yourself feel good. You do it because it's right. Because you remember what it felt like to need help and not have anywhere to turn. These families, they're not looking for handouts or charity that makes them feel ashamed. They're working hard, doing everything they can to build better lives. Sometimes life just needs a little help to give people the chance they deserve. And that's when everything changed. Hayes spent the next week walking through Lauderdale Courts with new eyes, identifying 50 families who were consistently behind on rent or facing eviction despite their best efforts. The criteria Elvis had established were specific and heartbreaking. Families with children who needed stability to succeed in school, elderly residents on fixed incomes who had nowhere else to go, parents dealing with medical emergencies that had drained their savings, and working families whose income had been disrupted by layoffs or workplace accidents. Hayes created elaborate documentation for each case, establishing fictional funding sources and assistance programs that would explain the sudden relief these families would experience. He developed letterheads for imaginary organizations, created bank accounts for charitable funds that existed only on paper, and recruited social workers who believed they were administrating legitimate assistance programs funded by anonymous local donors. The first letters went out in September 1956, each one carefully crafted to sound official and legitimate. 50 families received notifications that they had been selected for a new community assistance program that would cover their rent for the foreseeable future. The program was supposedly funded by a coalition of anonymous local donors who wanted to help working families maintain stable housing while they got back on their feet. Each letter was personalized, referencing specific circumstances that made each family eligible for assistance, creating the impression of a thorough application and review process that had never actually occurred. The response was overwhelming and heartbreaking in its gratitude. Hayes's office was flooded with grateful phone calls and visits from families who couldn't believe their incredible fortune. Margaret Williams, a single mother of 3 whose husband had died in Korea, wept uncontrollably when she received her letter. She'd been working double shifts at a textile factory and cleaning offices at night, coming home after midnight to help her children with homework, but still couldn't cover her $85 rent. The assistance meant her children wouldn't have to change schools or lose the only home they'd known since their father's death. Her youngest son, Tommy, could continue in the same classroom where he was finally making friends, and her daughter, Patricia, could finish her senior year of high school without the disruption of moving to a different neighborhood. James Crawford, a 72-year-old veteran living on a disability pension from injuries sustained in France during World War I, had been facing eviction for the third time that year. His monthly government check of $42 barely covered utilities and basic food, let alone the rent that seemed to increase every year while his income stayed exactly the same. When he received the assistance letter, he sat alone in his tiny kitchen and cried for the first time since he'd returned from the war in 1919, overwhelmed by the relief of knowing he wouldn't have to spend his final years homeless and ashamed. But Elvis wasn't finished. Every month, Elvis personally reviewed the detailed reports Hayes prepared about each family receiving assistance. He asked specific questions about their children's progress in school, their parents' job situations, their health problems, and medical needs. He wanted to know when kids graduated from high school, when parents found better employment, when medical emergencies arose that might require additional help beyond just rent payments. He became intimately familiar with the daily struggles and small victories of 50 families who had no idea he existed as anything more than a voice on the radio singing songs that played in their kitchens while they cooked dinner or cleaned house. When the Johnsons' youngest daughter needed emergency surgery for a heart defect that insurance wouldn't fully cover, Elvis quietly arranged for her medical bills to be covered by the same mysterious benefactor program. When the elderly Mr. Patterson's apartment needed heating repairs during a particularly brutal winter that left many elderly residents hospitalized with pneumonia, Elvis made sure the maintenance was completed immediately and at no cost to the tenant. When teenagers in the program graduated from high school but couldn't afford college tuition that would give them opportunities their parents never had, Elvis established a scholarship fund that would pay their tuition, books, and even living expenses if they needed to live on campus. The system Hayes had created was elaborate and foolproof, designed to withstand scrutiny from suspicious recipients and government auditors alike. Bills were paid through a complex series of accounts that traced back to legitimate charitable organizations and community funds that Elvis had secretly established with the help of attorneys who specialized in anonymous giving. Paperwork was meticulously maintained to ensure that the assistance appeared to come from multiple sources, never raising suspicion about a single benefactor with unlimited resources. Hayes even recruited other housing managers and social workers from across Memphis to help maintain the illusion, creating a network of people who believed they were administrating various legitimate assistance programs funded by different philanthropic sources. What he did next became legend. By 1960, Elvis's anonymous assistance program had expanded far beyond just rent payments. He was covering utilities that kept families cool during Memphis summers and warm during winter months, medical bills that could bankrupt a working family in a single emergency room visit, car repairs for families who needed reliable transportation to keep their jobs, and even Christmas presents for children whose parents couldn't afford anything beyond basic necessities. The fictional benefactor had become a legend in Lauderdale Courts, a mysterious guardian angel who seemed to appear whenever families reached their most desperate moments, when eviction notices arrived or medical emergencies threatened to destroy everything they'd worked to build. Elvis's commitment never wavered, even as his career reached unprecedented heights of fame and financial success. When he was drafted into the Army in 1958, he made detailed arrangements with Hayes to ensure the payments continued without interruption while he served in Germany. He established automatic transfers, backup funding sources, and emergency contacts who could authorize additional assistance if crises arose while he was overseas. When he returned from military service in 1960 and his music career exploded into movies and international superstardom, the assistance program quietly expanded to include more families and more comprehensive support that addressed not just housing, but education, healthcare, and emergency needs. The secrecy required elaborate planning and constant vigilance. Elvis would often drive to Memphis, late at night, parking several blocks away from Lauderdale Courts and walking through the complex in darkness to see how the families were doing. He'd sit in his car for hours, watching children playing in the courtyard, elderly residents tending small gardens between the buildings, parents coming home from late-shift jobs tired but grateful to have work. He knew their faces, their daily routines, their struggles and small triumphs, but they had no idea that the man sitting in the shadows was the reason they could sleep peacefully in their beds without fear of eviction notices or utility disconnections. Hayes became Elvis's closest collaborator in this secret mission of mercy. Every month, they would meet in Hayes's office after hours, when the building was empty and their conversations couldn't be overheard by curious tenants or other housing authority employees. They would review detailed reports about each family's progress, noting when children achieved academic milestones, when parents found better employment or completed job training programs, when medical crises were successfully resolved. Elvis would read these monthly reports like a father keeping track of his own children's achievements and setbacks, celebrating their successes and worrying about their challenges as if they were his own family members. But there was one more twist coming. In 1965, Hayes received an unexpected visit from Margaret Williams, the single mother who had been one of the first recipients of the assistance program 9 years earlier. Her youngest son, Tommy, was now 17 and had been accepted to Memphis State University on a full academic scholarship, his grades reflecting the stability that consistent housing had provided throughout his childhood. Her middle son, James, was serving honorably in Vietnam, sending letters home that spoke of his pride in serving his country and his gratitude for the education that had prepared him for military leadership. Her eldest daughter, Patricia, had become a registered nurse and was working at the same hospital where Tommy had been born, saving lives and building the kind of career that had seemed impossible when they faced eviction years earlier. Margaret had come to Hayes's office to ask a question that had been haunting her for years, a mystery that had grown more puzzling rather than less as time passed. "Mr. Hayes, I know this might sound crazy, but I've always wondered about our benefactor. In 9 years, through every crisis, every emergency, every moment when we needed help most desperately, the assistance was always there. It's been too consistent, too perfectly timed, too personal. Whoever is helping us knows our family intimately, really knows us. They know when Tommy broke his arm and needed medical care. They know when Patricia needed books for nursing school. They know when James needed warm clothes before he deployed overseas. Can you tell me who it is? I need to thank them properly for saving my children's lives." Hayes looked at this woman who had transformed from a desperate widow into a confident, successful mother, and he made a decision that would have surprised Elvis. Against every protocol they had established, against Elvis's absolute requirement for anonymity, he told her the truth. Margaret Williams sat in stunned silence as Hayes explained the entire program from its inception. Elvis Presley, the man whose music had been the soundtrack to her children's lives, whose songs played on their radio every morning as they got ready for school, had been quietly paying their rent for 9 years. He had covered Tommy's broken arm when he fell off his bike in 1962. He had paid for Patricia's nursing school textbooks and uniforms. He had ensured that James had warm clothes and proper gear before he deployed to Vietnam. Every crisis they had weathered, every opportunity they had seized, had been made possible by Elvis's anonymous generosity. "Why?" was the only word Margaret could manage through her tears. Hayes explained Elvis's philosophy, his own childhood memories of poverty and fear, his determination to help other families without seeking recognition or gratitude. He told her about the nights Elvis would drive through the complex alone, checking on families from a distance, the detailed attention he paid to every child's education and every parent's employment situation. He described Elvis's monthly review of family reports, his genuine concern for their well-being, his quiet pride in their achievements. Margaret asked if she could write Elvis a letter just to express her family's gratitude for the opportunities his kindness had created. Hayes explained that Elvis's one absolute requirement had always been complete anonymity. The families could never know, could never thank him, could never feel obligated to him in any way. But Margaret Williams had a different idea. She spent the next month quietly reaching out to other families in the program, carefully sharing what Hayes had told her. Slowly, word spread through Lauderdale Courts about their secret benefactor, passed in whispered conversations between trusted neighbors, shared in the quiet moments when children were asleep and adults could speak freely. 50 families began to understand that Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, had been their guardian angel for nearly a decade, asking nothing in return except their continued privacy about his involvement. Together, they decided to organize something unprecedented. They would honor Elvis's absolute requirement for anonymity by never publicly revealing his assistance, never speaking to reporters or writing to magazines, but they would find a way to let him know that his kindness had been discovered and was deeply appreciated by every family whose life he had transformed. What he did next became legend. On Christmas Eve 1965, Elvis was driving through Memphis in his usual late-night routine when he decided to make his customary visit to Lauderdale Courts. As he rounded the corner into the complex, driving slowly through the familiar streets where he had grown up poor and afraid, he saw something that stopped him cold. Every family in the assistance program had placed a single white candle in their front window. 50 apartments glowed with soft, warm light in the December darkness, creating a constellation of gratitude that illuminated the entire complex. Children and parents stood quietly in their doorways, not looking directly at Elvis's car, but clearly waiting for him to arrive, their presence both acknowledgement and promise. As Elvis parked his Cadillac under a streetlight, Tommy Williams, now 18 and home from his first semester of college, approached the vehicle with the respectful confidence that education and stability had given him. "Mr. Presley," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same Memphis accent as Elvis, but with the polish of someone who had been given opportunities, "We know what you've done for us. We know you don't want recognition or publicity, and we'll respect that always. But we wanted you to know that your kindness changed our lives, all of our lives. You gave us more than money. You gave us hope, stability, and the chance to become the people we were meant to be." Elvis sat in his car, overwhelmed by the display of silent gratitude surrounding him. 50 families who had benefited from his generosity for nearly a decade stood in their doorways, honoring his desire for privacy while expressing their appreciation in a way that would never violate his trust or expose his secret to the outside world. It was a moment of perfect understanding between a man who had given everything he could and the families whose lives he had transformed through quiet generosity. The assistance program continued for another 12 years until Elvis's death in 1977. By then, many of the original families had achieved financial stability and no longer needed help, their children educated and employed, their parents secure in retirement or better jobs. But Elvis had ensured that new families facing crisis would receive the same support, creating a legacy of assistance that outlasted his own life. Hayes estimated that over the 21 years of the program's existence, Elvis had quietly spent more than $1.2 million helping families maintain stable housing and build better lives for themselves and their children. After Elvis's death, Hayes finally revealed the full scope of the assistance program in interviews with Memphis newspapers and housing authorities. The stories that emerged from the families involved revealed the true impact of Elvis's generosity. Children who had gone to college because they didn't have to worry about housing costs, parents who had been able to start small businesses because they had stable homes as foundations, and elderly residents who had lived their final years with dignity because they never faced the terror of eviction or homelessness. Margaret Williams, by then a grandmother and retired nurse whose children had all built successful lives, spoke at a memorial service for Elvis in 1982. "People remember Elvis for his music, his movies, his fame and fortune," she said, her voice strong with conviction. "But 50 families in Memphis remember him as the man who made sure their children never went homeless, never had to choose between education and survival, never had to live in fear of losing everything they had worked to build. He gave us something more valuable than money. He gave us stability, hope, and the chance to build better lives. He proved that real kindness doesn't need applause or recognition. It just needs to quietly make the world better, one family at a time." Today, there's a small brass plaque in the courtyard of Lauderdale Courts that reads, in memory of all those who help others without seeking recognition. Only a few people who were involved in Elvis's assistance program know that it commemorates his 21-year commitment to ensuring that working families could maintain stable homes while pursuing better lives for themselves and their children. The original records of Elvis's assistance program are housed in the Memphis Public Library's special collections, sealed until 2027 to protect the privacy of the families involved and honor Elvis's absolute requirement for anonymity. Hayes, who died in 1995, left detailed documentation of every family helped, every crisis addressed, and every life transformed by Elvis's generosity, creating a historical record of compassion that operated completely outside the public eye. The story of Elvis's secret assistance program reminds us that true charity happens in the shadows, without cameras or recognition ceremonies. For 21 years, the most famous entertainer in the world quietly used his wealth to ensure that children had stable homes, parents could pursue better opportunities, and elderly residents could live with dignity. He proved that real generosity doesn't seek applause or recognition. It seeks only to quietly make the world a better place, one family at a time. If this incredible story of quiet generosity and lifelong commitment moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of helping others without seeking recognition. Have you ever experienced unexpected kindness that changed your life? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing true stories about the heart behind music's greatest legends.